takes a bit of time for it to start recording. I've got here it goes. Bonjour à tous, ici Paul Ponssot pour un nouveau podcast d'Au-delà de l'illusion. Et aujourd'hui, j'ai le plaisir d'avoir un invité très spécial, Jerry Marzinsky. Jerry Marzinsky est titulaire d'un diplôme en psychologie de l'Université du Temple et d'un master en thérapie de l'Université de Géorgie. Il a étudié 2 ans dans un programme de doctorat en psychologie. Avant de prendre sa retraite, c'était un praticien certifié, un psychothérapeute certifié. Il a passé 35 ans de son expérience professionnelle à travailler avec des patients schizophrènes et d'autres patients dans des hôpitaux psychiatriques et aussi dans le système pénitentiaire américain. C'est également un pilote commercial et un plongeur professionnel. Donc, c'est quelqu'un qui a énormément de cordes à son arc. Et aujourd'hui, on va parler de ce qu'il y a derrière la schizophrénie, mais plus généralement derrière les pensées intrusives. Et on va voir que ce que Jerry Marzinsky a à nous dire démontre sans l'ombre d'un doute la présence de vampires psychiques, d'entités parasites qui nous affectent dans le quotidien. Et ce qu'on peut appeler la schizophrénie, ce n'est qu'une partie de cela. C'est la partie la plus extrême de ces entités. Donc, voilà pour une interview très intéressante qui sera en anglais. Hello all of you and welcome to Au-delà de l'illusion. Today we've got a very special guest, Jerry Marzinsky. Jerry Marzinsky is a formal academic. Jerry Marzinsky's formal academic training comprises a BA in psychology from Temple University, a master's degree in counseling from the University of Georgia, and 2 years of study in a PhD psychology program. Prior to his retirement, he was a licensed psychotherapist. He has over 35 years of experience working with schizophrenic and other psychiatric patients in state hospitals, state prisons, and hospital emergency rooms. He is also a licensed commercial pilot and scuba diver. He lives in Tucson, Arizona, and Jerry Marzinsky is going to talk about what lies beneath schizophrenia. Now, for people who have followed my research on the non-human presence, Jerry Marzinsky will really confirm through his own research what we've been saying for years and what occultists have said for years and years before us. That is, there is a non-human presence that feeds off human emotions, of human energies, and that basically affects us in our everyday life, with schizophrenia being just the top end of the spectrum. So, welcome, Jerry, to the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, first of all, tell us a bit how you got interested in the voice phenomenon.
Well, it started years ago when I was in undergraduate school, and what I hated about psychology was that, unlike engineering or any other discipline, you couldn't verify for yourself what they were saying. You had to take for granted that everything they were saying was true, because there's no way to get into a psych hospital or a mental health center or any kind of formal institution that held the mentally ill. You couldn't get in there. You can't just walk in the door and go, "Hey, I want to study this. I want to see if this is true." So here's 4 years of having to deal with, and I didn't trust authority. That was a big thing behind I mean, I never fully trusted authority. So here they were teaching all this stuff, and the first thing that hit me, I remember in undergraduate school, was a paper that a psychologist wrote that we were told to read. And basically what it said was that if two schizophrenics encountered each other with the same hallucination, if both of them thought they were King George, this psychologist was saying that one of them would have to give way and change his identity to some other fictional character. And I'm like, what kind of sense does that make? They're two crazy guys, and they both think they're King George. I mean, why would one of them have to change? It didn't make any sense. So I had no way to disprove that or prove it or anything, because, like I said, they have you locked out of clinical populations. In the 40 years I've been working with psychiatric patients, I've never once seen a researcher in any of the institutions that I worked at actually looking into what was actually happening. It's like they're programmed in graduate school and they're released with these fabrications that the psychiatric mafia and psychology has put into their heads. So I logged that one in, and one day it was maybe, I don't know how many years later, maybe even as much as a decade later, I was doing rounds on one of the big psychiatric wards, and a new guy had appeared, a new patient had appeared, and it was my job to kind of size up all the new psych patients that were coming on the unit, see what they were going to do, how they were reacting, how they were behaving, and seeing if they needed medications. So I came up to this guy, and he was arguing with somebody. He was carrying on a vehement argument, but it was like listening to one side of a telephone conversation, where he was arguing with somebody, but he was arguing in full sentences, and he was upset, and he's walking around arguing with somebody, but it's like listening to one side of a telephone conversation. So I kind of crept up on him and trying to listen to what he was saying. And then he saw me, and I walked up and said, hey, I'm Jerry, I'm the psych for this unit. I haven't met you before, what's your name? And he looks at me and he goes, I'm Jesus Christ. And I thought for a second, and then I looked him straight in the eye and I went, no, you can't be Jesus Christ, because I am. And I'm waiting for his response, to see, is what they told me 10 years ago true? I mean, if two people with the same delusion encounter each other, will one of them have to change? So is he going to change his delusion? Because and I was adamant about it. I said, no, I am. You can't be. And he sat there and he thought for a minute, and he looked around, and then he looks at me and he goes, okay, we can both be Jesus Christ. And he strolls off. I'm like, okay, what else did they lie to me about? That was the first time. And then later I found out that 80% of what psychologists publish is not replicable. So it can't be repeated. So only 20% of what they publish holds any water. And I saw when I was in graduate school that it's publish or perish. It doesn't matter what they're publishing as long as they're publishing something. So that kind of dampened my trust for what they were putting out. And then it came to psychiatry. So I was working at the biggest state hospital in the world at that time. I mean, there were like 10,000 patients there when I first arrived in Milledgeville, Georgia. And one of the things I'd been told was that schizophrenics were schizophrenic because they had a chemical brain imbalance. That's what they were teaching in graduate school. And they were also teaching that they had some genetic upset, but something was wrong with their brain. I mean, their brains were broken. And there was some kind of chemical imbalance there. So they're teaching this in all institutions, and this is pushed by big pharma. You know, they want everybody to believe that. So one thing I noticed is that none of the psychiatrists, before they dished out any of their medications, took any kind of samples. They didn't take any blood work. They didn't do any kind of test. They didn't do anything to determine what the chemical balance of the brain was. And they just kind of got a dartboard and just mentally, oh, well, okay, we'll start them on this antipsychotic medication and see what happens. You know, it was like a dartboard. They are spinning a wheel. It was like, you know, based on their experience, maybe this isn't, but there was no measurement. And I'm thinking like, well, how are they going to know what's out of balance or by how much if they don't have any tests? And I looked into it, and no tests exist for that. There is not a single test to verify any of the diagnoses. You know, and I think, what is it, 250 something now in the DSM-5, you know, the Bible for psychiatry. There's not a single medical lab test to verify any of those diagnoses. You know, they were all made up by psychiatrists. You know,
and the question is, what is behind that psychiatric mafia? Well, that 80% of flawed psychiatry, what is behind it? Because in my research, I've come across the Rockefeller family, I've come across eugenics, secret societies such as Nazi-linked secret societies. So in your experience, you've experienced that firsthand. What's behind that flawed psychiatry?
Well, where it started off was in the 1930s when here in the U.S., where Rockefeller and you know, Standard Oil and all these big multimillionaires kind of took over the medical schools. You know, so they bought off the U.S. Congress to make laws that the only doctors that could be licensed would practice pharmacology. There's no other treatment. All the others were outlawed. You know, the electrical therapy, the naturopathy, all the other forms of treatment were considered garbage. And the only valid form of treatment that they had enacted by law was, you know, pharmacology, treating people with drugs. So they virtually put out of business all the medical schools except for, you know, a couple of the big ones over here, making those laws that if they didn't teach pharmacology, they weren't licensed as a doctor. And the big pharma was behind this. So all the medical schools had to teach, you know, pharmacology. All the others were outlawed and made illegal. Any doctor who referred a patient to any other form of treatment was risking their license back then. And since then, big pharma and the medical industry has taken over the medical schools. So the medical schools are basically teaching what big pharma wants them to teach. You know, they're providing huge grants. They're taking money if they don't. And they're still publishing lies. They're still, if you read their advertisements, they're still saying that schizophrenia is due to a chemical brain imbalance. Well, they have no proof of that whatsoever. Matter of fact, it's been disproved over and over and over again. But what they want to do is sell their toxic drugs. They want no interference with their office visits. They want no interference with their sale of drugs. And between psychiatry and big pharma together, they're making $447 billion a year selling these toxic antipsychotic drugs that they put out on the market and are selling around the world. And those drugs don't cure anything. They don't cure schizophrenia. What they do is they're major tranquilizers, and they'll weaken the voices. But they, in virtually all cases, they don't get rid of them. So when the people stop taking those drugs, the voices reappear.
And what are the side effects of those drugs? Because in France, there's basically I think it's the same in the US, but there's basically about millions and millions of people that are either on antidepressant drugs or antipsychotic drugs. So what are the side effects of those drugs?
Oh, they're horrible. I have them listed here. Let me see if I can find them. You know, dry mouth, sexual dysfunction. You feel like you're. It's like a combination of being nervous and drugged down at the same time. See if I can find these things. Here it is, A2.
Of an interruption. So tell us the side effect of those drugs.
Well, the antipsychotic drugs that they're using even today, I mean, they have less side effects, but they're some of the most dangerous and toxic drugs used in medical practice today. Yeah. But the psychiatrists won't tell the patients that. You know, they can cause permanent, well, matter of fact, they shrink your brain, and they can cause permanent neurological damage with extended use. So where they started first finding this was with mental patients in the psych hospitals when they did autopsies. They found that their brains were shrunk, you know, and the you know, legitimate researchers would publish that, and then big pharma and the psychiatric mafia jumped up screaming, no, it's not the drugs, it's a schizophrenia doing that. You know, it's not our drugs. So some other researchers started giving these antipsychotic drugs to animals, to monkeys. And they found that their brains were shrunk and their peripheral nervous systems were rotted out also. So they proved it. So the psychiatric mafia and the big drug companies, they blocked that research, and they wouldn't publish it. They wouldn't put it out there. But these drugs should not be used on a permanent basis unless the patient is totally out of control. You know, there was no other way to control them, and that's not so with most. So what happens is the side effects, the toxic effects of these drugs. I mean, it's not, you can call them side effects, but what they are is poisonous, toxic effects of these drugs. And what they do is they cause muscle rigidity. They slow your movements. It's like your brain has got syrup on it. There's involuntary muscle jerking. There's muscle tremor. There's restlessness and a feeling as if one needs to be in constant motion. There's tardive dyskinesia, which is actually the neurological damage taking place. It's their involuntary movements of the face and the mouth and the lips and the arms and legs, and tongue darting, where your tongue darts out. There's neuroleptic malignant syndrome. It's a life-threatening condition that's characterized by muscle rigidity, fever, sweating, irregular heartbeat, blood pressure changes, altered mental status, confusion, disorientation. And these are all side effects of these crappy drugs. So dizziness, weight gain, sexual dysfunction, cardiac effects, hypotension, dry mouth, constipation, nausea, vomiting, headache. So these aren't fun drugs to take, and they're not abusable. Nobody in their right mind is going to abuse these things. You know, in Mexico, you can go to Mexico and go over the border, and you can get these drugs in the pharmacy over the counter. You know, so if you've already been prescribed them, you don't have to keep going back to the psychiatrist to get them again. Yeah, you can walk in and say, I want this, and so nobody in their right mind would take these things. You know, they're awful drugs, but psychiatry and big pharma want to keep control of that. And like I said, between psychiatry and big pharma, they're making $447 billion a year on office visits and the sale of these toxic drugs. But they're so awful, schizophrenics don't want to stay on them. You know?
And so they're efficient just when the people are really in a really psychotic in an attack phase, and then a proper psychiatrist should then wean the patient from the drugs once they're better and once they've had proper therapy.
Well, the therapies that they have right now don't work. You know, there are we know what to do. I mean, it's the voices that drive schizophrenia. You know, that's psychiatry has gone as far as to label the voices a thought disorder. But that's it. They stopped there. And then what they declared was the voices are hallucinations. So look what they've done with that proclamation. And they have no research to back that. None. Just in their infinite arrogance, they just stand up and go, yeah, the voices are hallucinations due to a broken brain because they say so. You know, there is no broken brain. You know, they have not been able to find any chemical imbalance in the brain of schizophrenics. They have not been able to find any genetic marker for schizophrenia. So all this, what they're doing is they're desperate to search for a physical cause for schizophrenia so they can keep selling drugs, you know, these toxic drugs that merely suppress the symptoms. And what's even more disastrous is that when these symptoms start to occur, they will add other drugs. So they'll tell the patient there is no cure. You got to take these awful drugs for the rest of your life. That's the only treatment there is. You know, and these are the high priest of psychiatry. So here's voices start appearing in the patient's head, and they're getting in trouble, and they're telling them to do awful things, and then they go to the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist tells them, well, your brain is broken due to a chemical imbalance, and there's nothing you can do about it except take these toxic drugs. And they're expensive. I think it's close to $800 to $1,000 a month for them to stay sane if they don't have insurance by taking these drugs.
So it's a total ripoff, and it's total destruction of the mind and body.
Well, yeah, these drugs are very, very toxic. But the thing is, they don't know what else to do. You know, and back when I was working at the hospital, the state hospital, it was like that's all they knew to do. You know, and they could keep large populations under control by drugging them silly with these things. You know, so they could reduce staff, and you know, that's kind of what they're doing now with psychiatrists on the street. You know, look at what the typical schizophrenic goes through. I mean, these voices appear in their heads that are intrusive thoughts, and they're not good. You know, they're telling them to, you know, hit people, you know, cuss people out, leave, isolate, you know, to do all these kind of antisocial things, and they're like, what's going on here? They're, you know, sometimes they start gradually, sometimes they start suddenly. But they go to a psychiatrist because they're the high priest of mental health. They've taken over the mental health system. And look what they're told. Your brain is broken. There is no cure. You must take these awful drugs for the rest of your life. And you must keep coming to me to get your prescriptions filled. You know, when your prescription runs out, you have to come back here so I can check and see that you're adjusted properly, or you need some other kind of antipsychotic. So, you know, it's a scam that way. You can't get these things over the counter here in the U.S., and I imagine you can't get them over the counter over there because the drug companies have taken care of that. You know, they want you to pay through the nose for these drugs, and they want the pharmacists involved, and they want the psychiatrists to have their cut.
Well, you see that in the US, and I think it's the same in Europe, even with the latest medical scam, basically, what's been going on for the past 2 years. And actually, some hospitals in some states of the US have been paid $20,000 or $30,000 for putting somebody on a ventilator, when in fact it's not the proper treatment in most forms. So that really shows, and it kills most of the people. So it really shows how corrupt the medical industry is. And with psychiatry, it's even worse, because then there's all the eugenics connection and all that, people that are mentally ill, or supposed to be mentally ill, or deemed by the system unworthy and all that. So they'll even be more pushed down and more destroyed than ordinary people. As ordinary, of course, just a way of saying it, but there's other people.
Yeah, and you know, I watched what happened here. Is they closed down all the state hospitals where psychiatric patients used to reside. So they dumped them all onto the street, and you know, the schizophrenics hate these medications. You know, that virtually at one time or another, all of them go off those medications, and then they revert back into a psychotic state. And you know, I'd wonder, well, why are they doing that? Do they want to go crazy? Do they want to, you know, do they enjoy the psychotic state? Why do they all keep going off their medications? So schizophrenia is a very self-destructive disease. It's not a disease, it's a condition. They want you to believe it's a disease.
Yeah, and it's something that actually kills people, because people think that schizophrenia just makes you mad. Well, it's terrible, but it actually kills people. I mean, I read that in your book. 1/10 of schizophrenics commit suicide, and their life expectancy is very much reduced versus the real population. So it's a condition that's deadly, that's lethal, and that's when we'll get into the voices. Also, a lot of psychiatrists who treat schizophrenic people commit suicide. That's a fact that shows that there's much more than a biological process that's involved, that there's an external factor, and that external factor is non-human. So what's your take on that?
Well, yeah, you're right. That external factor is non-human. The voices are energetic entities. They are not hallucinations. You know, they run very fixed patterns that I sent you. And if they're running fixed patterns, they can't be hallucinations. Hallucinations don't run fixed patterns. So, you know, what's psychiatry? I mean, psychiatry and psychology are both spiritually devoid. I mean, you know, they don't understand that people are spiritual beings, that we're not just physical beings, we're spiritual beings at hearts, and that these bodies are spacesuits, but the real us is a spiritual being inside this body. You know, and psychiatry is just struggling to make schizophrenia a physical disease that they can drug. You know, but it's not. The closest they've ever come was saying it was a thought disorder. Now, schizophrenics get very confused about what's going on with them. Society believes that thoughts are who you are. I mean, if you have a thought going through your head, it belongs to you. I mean, where else could it come from? But if you think a second, you step back and you look at those thoughts and you listen to those thoughts, and you're sitting there concentrating on them coming in and out of your mind. Who's the one listening? Who's the one watching? So the first misnomer is you're not your thoughts. And your thoughts are not who you are. You are the one who's listening and watching them. Now, what the schizophrenic voices do is they invade the patient's mind, and they call them intrusive thoughts. They just barge in there, and they sound just like the patient's normal thoughts. You know, that there's no change in intonation. There's no, you know, it doesn't sound different. There's no harsh, you know, there's nothing like that. They sound just like the thousands of other thoughts that go through the patient's head every day.
So it's not really a voice per se. It's more an intrusive thought.
Well, it is a voice because it's talking to them, but it is an intrusive thought also. You know, it barges its way in there, and everybody's experienced those. You know, where you're walking down the street and all of a sudden, you know, you get this intrusive thought to punch this guy or beat the crap out of this one or smash your car into this something or other, or, you know, drive off the road or you know, it's just something that startles you. You know, it's a thought that comes into your mind and just startles you because you would never act on it. You know, it doesn't belong to you. It's foreign to your identity. But it barges in there and it tells you to do something totally ridiculous that you would never do. So that's kind of what it's like, you know. But with schizophrenics, it's happening all the time. And since we're taught that all our thoughts are ours, the schizophrenics are like, well, that must be me because who else could it be? Yeah. But these thoughts are fighting against their intention for themselves. So there's two different intentions set up. The intention of what the voices want them to do and their intention of what they don't want to do. So a lot of times at the state hospital, you'd see patients arguing with the voices against doing something that the voices wanted them to do. There was one lady who the voices were telling her to leave the hospital grounds, and she was arguing with them, going, "I don't want to leave the hospital grounds," as she was walking off toward away from the hospital. So, you know, psychiatry is insisting that the voices are hallucinations, but they run a series of patterns. You know, so after study, and psychiatry won't study them. You know, and look what they've done by doing that. So by declaring that the voices are hallucinations and publishing this in all the journals, in all the medical schools, in you know, and cranking out thousands of psychiatrists who've been brainwashed to think that the voices are hallucinations without any research backing whatsoever. You know, who in their right mind is going to study a hallucination?
Well, that's very true. And also, in my personal experience, when I've spoken to people, definitely thoughts do not come from us. Just last 3 or 4 days ago, I was invited to see somebody that practices meditation. So then I spoke with him and all that about the state you are in when you meditate, and he said that basically there are no thoughts. He's there, he's conscious of his surroundings, but he has absolutely no thoughts in his head. It's basically he's totally empty of thoughts. He clears all the trash basically. So the thoughts are exterior to us. That's that really makes sense, and it's a synchronicity in the fact that I was speaking to somebody very recently who said that. So it's extremely interesting.
Well, you got two sources for them. It is your past experiences, and what you've learned about the world and society and the people around you. You know? And then you've got all these unacceptable thoughts or insults or tragedies or traumas that are packed inside that you don't want to face. So those are buried, and when they're set off, there's an explosion. You know, that it's like somebody comes up that says something to you and it triggers you, and you boom, you react. You know, you don't even think about it. So you got that stuff going on, and then you got these entities that are putting thoughts in your mind also at the same time. But like Sherry said, every thought that is negative against yourself or anybody else does not come from you. You know, you are a pure energetic being, and that energy is clouded and sucked up by these negative structures that have been learned or put around it.
And that's really makes sense, because well, basically it's happened to me a lot. You don't do things, you lose a lot of opportunities in your life because something says to you that you're not capable of doing it. And that's happened to me really a lot. It's happened to everybody. You're going to do
Yes.
something, you motivated, even for example, a university exam or whatever, you've really studied hard for it, and then something says you're no good, you'll never succeed, and you end up not succeeding, or even you do something, whatever, something will say you won't succeed, you're not good enough, and you end up not succeeding. So I think those intrusive thoughts have much more impact on our everyday life. For people who aren't schizophrenic, I'm talking about, for ordinary people. Well, I don't like the term ordinary, because what's ordinary, what's not ordinary, but for people that don't have the extreme of schizophrenia, those thoughts can actually mess up somebody's life totally.
Well, so you brought up an important point here, is they don't just hit schizophrenics. They hit us all. And they hit us all with thoughts like that. You're no good. You're stupid. You're not good enough. Nobody likes you. Nobody loves you. Nobody will ever love you. You're going to fail. You're ugly. You're stupid. You know, all those kind of thoughts. You know, you're not good enough. All of those come from the dark side. You know, they're not inherent in the spiritual being which you are, you know, which is perfect. So what all of those thoughts do is generate negative emotional energy. And that's what these things feed off of. That's what they're after. That's why they're inserting these negative thoughts in there. They're not just doing it for fun, they're doing it for food. You know? And for probably more than a decade, I noticed that the schizophrenics that I worked with in the institutions, after the voices attacked them, they would be completely drained. Some of them were so drained they couldn't even get out of bed to eat breakfast in the morning. You know, and some of them actually said that they could feel their energy leaving when these voices were attacking them. They could actually feel their energy being sucked out of them. And I didn't know what that was. What I noticed is if I worked with any more than 2 of them a day, that I would come home and I was so drained I couldn't get anything else done at home. I just would plop down on the sofa and I'd be drained. So I would limit the number of them I would work with in a day, even though I found them fascinating. And it was like, you know, after a while, I really trying to figure out what was going on with them was driving me nuts. It was like, this doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense. Why do they keep going off their medications and going crazy? Why do they do these stupid things? And what are the voices? And why are they telling them these things? But you know, any attempt to study the voices when psychiatry was around, I mean, there's twice where I've been hauled up in front of the medical director and told the voices are hallucinations. You will not ask patients about these voices. They're hallucinations, that's what they are. And all you're doing is making the patient worse by asking them questions about what they are and what they're being told. You're reinforcing the hallucinations. And I knew that wasn't true. But boy, they were putting the clamp on it. They don't want anybody studying what these voices are and bringing out the truth. They want to keep the same narrative that they have, that is making them a fortune selling these drugs and having people believe that the only treatment for schizophrenia is their toxic drugs. And then when these awful side effects start appearing, what they do is they pile more drugs on top of it, like cogentin, to mask those negative side effects. So when those neurological symptoms of damage start appearing, they then mask those also, so that the damage continues to go on, but the patient isn't experiencing it because it's masked by these other drugs. And I've never seen a psychiatrist sit down with a patient and explain to them all the side effects that these drugs can have and how dangerous they actually are. They don't do that. I've never seen one in my entire career sit down and explain how dangerous these drugs can be. They just say, well, you got to be on them for the rest of your life because that's the way it is. There is no cure. You got to take them. You got to come back and see me once a month or something to make sure your medications are adjusted right.
And I was thinking of that hypothesis when I was reading your book. Let's say you have a schizophrenic or a person suffering from a so-called mental disorder. They go and see a psychiatrist who's totally taken in with the system, with medical school, but basically doesn't know about those entities. He doesn't have an agenda behind him or anything. He's just basically taken in by the system with scientific materialism and that. He'll diagnose the person with schizophrenia, and he'll say to the person, right, you've got an incurable disease, your brain is sick, you'll have to take those drugs all your life. Well, the person will get very, very depressed, very, very sad, because schizophrenia often happens with young people under 20, under 30 or 40. So imagine that young person, he goes to a psychiatrist, he gets a diagnosis like that, and that person will give off negative energy of sadness, and that will exacerbate the voices. So it'll be like a vicious circle.
Right. Look at the hopeless message that they're giving these patients. Here they come in there, they don't know what's going on. Something's wrong with their minds. They don't know what it is. They don't know what to do about it. They go to a psychiatrist. He tells them their brains are broken. There is no cure. They have to keep coming back for these awful medications for the rest of their life. And the cost is astronomical. So they're like, whoa, that's like Dante's Inferno, where above the gate is like, all those who walk through these gates leave any hope behind. So it's a very debilitating, very depressive message. And they're brainwashed to believe that these voices are hallucinations, and that's what they believe. And they're not allowed to look into them. Any psychiatrist who publishes a paper that counters what the establishment is saying is not going to get that paper published, and is going to be blown off. They're going to face repercussions. The only reason I could come out with this stuff is that I'm retired and they can't get their hands on me anymore. Otherwise, I would have been fired. So what the schizophrenic is faced with is they're hearing these voices that are appearing in their minds, that they're carrying on conversations with and arguing with, that are telling them to do things that are unacceptable. And they've been told, like everybody else, that all thoughts that appear in your mind belong to you. So in their gut, they're feeling like, well, this can't be me, but who else can it be? So that one of the first things they're faced with is trying to figure out what these invasive voices are, and how they operate, and what they should do about them. So they go to the psychiatrist, they get that very debilitating, depressive message, and those who believe what the psychiatrist said are the ones that are least likely to recover fully from schizophrenia. If they buy that hook, line, and sinker, they're least likely to recover. They're more likely to commit suicide. They're more likely to suffer neurological damage. Then there's a second group that don't fully believe what the psychiatrists say, but can't believe that the voices, which they experience as very real, are not something else. And they're struggling to try to find out, well, are these my thoughts, or are these the thoughts of somebody else? Or is psychiatry right? So they're in this limbo state. They're not quite sure what's going on. And what they decide as to what the voices are will predict their probability of recovering fully from schizophrenia. if they buy into what psychiatry says, that this is a permanent, neurological thing, their brains are broken, which there is no proof. I mean, there is no proof for what psychiatry is saying, none. Their brains aren't broken. There are no genetic markers. They've never, and they keep perpetuating these lies because it sells drugs. So if they believe what psychiatry said, their chances of committing suicide and never recovering are much higher than a third group who realizes that the voices are not who they are, that they're invasive entities of some kind, that their intention does not match their intention, that voices' intentions don't match their intention. Like when you get a intrusive negative thought commanding you to do something that you don't want to do, that's not your intention and you're not going to do it. Well, so do these guys. So they've come to the conclusion that these voices are not who they are. There's something else, even though they might not know exactly what they are, they know that they're not them. So there's a psychological distance between the voices and who they view themselves to be. Now, when any of these groups ask the voices themselves, who are you? The voices will respond, we are you. So the voices want them to believe that those thoughts are their thoughts. That they're not from a foreign entity, that all thoughts that enter your mind belong to you. So what they do then is they start inserting these negative intrusive thoughts that are very upsetting to the patient. And when the patient goes to fight it or resist it, there's an awful lot of negative emotional energy generated. And these entities then suck that energy off. So basically what the voices are doing to schizophrenics and the rest of us are the same things we do to cattle, dairy cattle, is they set them out in the field, they eat grass, they produce milk, the farmer brings them in, isolates them, milks them, takes the milk, and then sets them out to pasture again to eat more grass and then milks them again. So that's what these things are doing to us. So they insert negative, upsetting, intrusive thoughts into your mind, your thought stream, and they take that upset and they drain off the negative emotional energy that is produced. And that's their food. That's what they feed off of. They could give a damn about us as beings, as humans. What they want is that energy. And they can't eat negative or positive energy. It has to be negative emotional energy. They can't produce their own energy. They have to get it from somewhere else. So they're parasites. So they're just like a leech. If you saw a leech on you, you wouldn't just sit there and go, oh, that's a hallucination, and you wouldn't leave it there. You would try to get rid of it. So the schizophrenics who realize that these voices are parasitic entities, that's the last thing the voices want them to realize. And that in clinical situations, when you're about to tell the patient that, and at some point they need to know that, the voices go nuts. So if you're going to get a negative explosive reaction from a schizophrenic patient, it would be when you try to tell them that the voices are parasites, because that's the last thing the voices want them to understand. They want them to think that the voices are them. That's who they are. So it's a battle for the mind. These voices are like a mind virus. And when psychiatry is telling me, oh, they're hallucinations, it's like, yeah, there's hallucinations and there's nothing you can do about them other than take our toxic medications. That's their message. But there's a lot you can do about those voices. There's a lot of different ways to block them and circumvent them and short circuit them and to fight them and drive them off.
Well, that's very important. We'll talk about that a bit later, because that's really, really important. But first of all, how does schizophrenia set in? Because I've spoken to people with obsessive compulsive disorders, mild forms of depression, mild forms of anxiety that don't stop them from functioning, but that affects them in their everyday life. And what they say is that those symptoms just began like that. They just begin like that. And I've spoken also to people with schizophrenia, and they said, the ones who I've spoken to anyway, that the symptoms just started like that. One day the symptoms just started like that. Is that how things usually start? Do they start abruptly, or can they start very slowly? Can the voices, the entities, sort of to start with, make the person, affect the person with intrusive thoughts, and then make their vibration go down, and then put more intrusive thoughts, and then up to the point that it becomes full-blown schizophrenia? How do those diseases start?
Well, that's
Diseases,
that's a
not
good
diseases,
question,
and
because it's a
conditions
question
start.
I had when I was studying the voices also. They can start both ways. Now, where they originate is two ways, two major ways that schizophrenia is initiated. One is by severe emotional, sexual, or physical abuse. People who are severely abused in those ways are much more likely to start experiencing schizophrenic symptoms and voices than others.
So could the mind control programs like MK Ultra, the Monarch Project, be there to induce schizophrenia on a massive scale? And could even events like 9/11 that are extremely traumatic, or the COVID that are extremely traumatic, could they be events that are staged by those entities, or governments controlled by those entities, to
Well,
create mass
I
possession?
believe so. I believe so. 9/11 and even this COVID garbage that they're doing now. They concoct all this stuff. They carry it out. It terrorizes the people. And when the people are scared, they'll clamp onto anything that they think will save them. And then the government goes, oh, come to us, come to us. So yeah, I think right now all this COVID stuff is thoughts put out by the dark side. 9/11 was carried out by entity possessed government officials and the CIA and the U.S. government, to start a war. So the planet right now, we're in a huge spiritual battle right now between good and evil. And evil's being exposed like never before. So the second major way that schizophrenia is brought on is by meth, amphetamine. I working in the prison, there were so many prisoners who were using meth and end up committing crimes or killing somebody. So that the prisoners called meth the devil's drug. And it does something to open up the spiritual protection people have, and allows the invasion by these entities. And the way it might start off, it may start off just like you said, very sudden. All of a sudden, at the age of 25 or so, these voices start appearing in their mind, telling them to do rotten things, telling them they're no good, they're rotten, they're stupid, and just plaguing them with that kind of stuff, or compulsive thoughts, or depressive thoughts. But they're all thoughts, and thoughts are not who you are. So that's one of the big things where psychiatry and psychology are way off base. They're still thinking that all thoughts belong to the person. They're not aware that thoughts are energetic entities. There is no space, there is no time, there is no matter where thoughts are, and the same where the voices are. The voices aren't physical. There is no space, there is no time for them, there is no material in their world. So they can follow a schizophrenic patient all over the world. There's nothing that blocks them physically or mentally from doing that. And until psychiatry realizes that it is the schizophrenic voices that drive schizophrenia. It's the schizophrenic voices that drive abnormal behavior and schizophrenics. It's not any kind of broken brain that they can medicate, but they're just clutching at straws to keep their discipline going. And in order to do that, they have to convince the population that their brains are broken, that schizophrenic brains are broken, or that there's something wrong with your brain because you're depressed, or there's something wrong with your brain because you're compulsive, or something wrong with your brain because you're bipolar, or something wrong with your brain. It's all blame the brain, blame the brain, blame the brain. But they know that schizophrenia is a thought disorder, but that's where they drop the ball. They have never studied the disordered thoughts of schizophrenics. And they're pushing the brain, because they can drug the brain. The brain is like a radio receiver. You turn it to a certain frequency, and the thoughts come in. Just like you turn the radio to a different channel to play music, and different kinds of music come in. The schizophrenics are stuck at a low frequency. No matter what psychology and psychiatry say, they have never found a thought inside the brain. And to say that the brain, the thoughts, the brain is broken because the thoughts are playing at a certain frequency is like saying, to a radio receiver, is digging inside the radio receiver to try to find the person whose voice is coming out of it. It's the same thing. They're not going to find where those thoughts are coming from. They've never found a thought in the brain. They've never done an autopsy of the brain and seen a thought in there, because these are not of this universe. They are not of the physical universe. So they've just blown off the whole thing with disruptive thoughts, or what the voices are, or how to deal with them. And they just go, well, the only way to deal with them is our expensive toxic drugs.
And could there not be, at the top of all that, I'm really saying at the very top, a collusion between between secret societies, the deep state, whatever you call it, and those entities? Because, for example, I work basically. I sell books. I sell books on the internet. I used to have a shop in Paris and all that, and basically, and that's what astonished me when I read your book, and from what you've just said, basically, I used to have people buying books, offering books, and there was a lady that wanted to offer a book to somebody that was in prison, and she was saying she had a lot of difficulty delivering a simple book. I don't remember what it was, nothing extraordinary, a book, I think an Eckhart Tolle book or something on meditation, basically, something, a very random book. And when we read your book, when we hear you speak, it looks as if there's the drug traffic in prison. How can they introduce drugs in prisons when it's even difficult to deliver a book, to give a book to somebody? So there's obviously somebody that knows what the drugs are, what they do, and wants to give them to prisoners and even to the population, because the war on drugs, or the so-called war on drugs, could be won really easily with all the technology of governments. But in America, and it's starting to come to Europe, there's all that OPSA crisis and all that with the fentanyl and things like that. So it seems as if there's a complicity at a high level to deliver drugs. Now, I'm sure there's money involved at one level, but at another level, there's a spiritual factor. There's a will by somebody very high up, or some entities, to induce mental illness, schizophrenia, on a massive scale. And then you have also the New Age movement and all that, saying, well, drugs are good things and all that, when they kill every day. So it's I think there's a coordinated plan. What do you think about that too?
Well, I think you're right. Like I said, there's a huge battle between good and evil going on this planet right now, and evil has ruled this planet for thousands of years. But now it's being exposed at a level like it's never been before. And yeah, I think the drug companies are complicit in this. China's complicit in this. I hear they found a freighter off the coast of the U.S. that was loaded with enough fentanyl to kill everybody in North and South America, coming from the Chinese. The Chinese are selling the Mexican cartel drugs to produce meth. So we're in a war and we're under attack right now, and so are you.
Yeah,
we all are.
In Europe, definitely. Things are really well. We've basically, in France anyway, through the vaccine passes and all that, we've lost our basic freedoms, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, if you don't comply, you can't go to a restaurant, you can't go to a cafe, you can't go to a museum, you can't take a train, you can't take a bus, you can't live an ordinary life as such. So it's and it's the same in a lot of European countries. So I think it's everywhere, basically.
Yeah, they've tried to do the same thing here. But there's a huge battle going on here right now for that too. I mean, there's all kinds of legal challenges. The Canadians are blocking off, their major cities, and there's a huge convoy starting in California heading for Washington, D.C. right now. So people have to resist. They can't just take this lying down. They have to fight this evil, in whatever way they can. Spread information, fund legal groups. Because these people are trying to kill us.
Yeah, not only our body, but also our mind.
Our minds and our souls. Yeah. So, I have no doubt that the higher ups in this are eaten up by these negative entities that I'm talking about in schizophrenia. There's these people are psychopaths.
And can the entities behind the voices, can they affect the physical body? Because in your book you talk about people with scratches, but also I've been studying the works of Rudolf Steiner, and he said that most illnesses, well, there's of course physical factors that play a part, bad eating habits, microbes and all that. So it's multifactorial, but one of the factors behind illnesses are the presence of what he calls Ahrimanic and Luciferian entities in different organs, and the way they're positioned, the way they affect the organ will cause them different types of illnesses. Now, I think, and he said that over 100 years ago, I think there's validity in that. So does your work confirm, apart from the scratches, that those entities can affect the physical body at one level or another?
Yeah, I think to some degree they can. But one thing that has surprised me, that a large number of schizophrenics are physically okay. They're not mentally okay. If you believe, well, more than once, these things attack in the dreams too. They attack through nightmares. So they don't want the schizophrenic to sleep. So they attack because if they keep them awake, they don't have the energy to resist the voices. And the voices don't want them to resist. They want them to do whatever they want them to do. So they come through in dreams, and some of the most dastardly ones where they would tell the patient, you're going to die of cancer in a year. And if the patient believes that, then they get cancer in a year. So yeah, your mind can make you sick. And if these voices are constantly telling you, yeah, you're going to die of this or you're going to die of that, you create it. So the human spirit creates things, and when it believes that something is true, it'll create it.
Yeah, that's true. But and in fact, there's people that do décodage biologique, biological decoding, and they've had very good success basically by finding the trauma, the beliefs behind an illness. They've had some success in at least alleviating symptoms of illnesses, and even they've had success with chronic diseases and cancer. But and I've spoken to some of those practitioners, but all of them, apart from one, don't consider the presence of those entities. Even in the therapeutic community, the open-minded ones, there's only one lady who I know who understands the presence of these entities, who studied the presence of these entities, but the others don't want to know about the entities, and yet they're very open-minded people. They'll talk about the mechanisms of the mind on matter. They'll try and decode the origins of an illness, but they don't want to hear about entities, except one.
Yeah, and same way with psychiatry. And until they wake up to the fact that these are entities, that the voices are real entities, they're never going to find a cure for schizophrenia, because it's the voices that drive paranoid schizophrenia. They're the driving force behind it. It's the voices that tell the schizophrenic who they are, what and what they're going to do. And everybody's seen crazy people kill a bunch of people out on the streets. These mass murders and mass shootings are usually done by people that are eaten up with voices. So one of the things the voices do, the schizophrenics do, is they run fixed set patterns, and these patterns don't waver. And one of the first patterns, and you can look at this at yourself, and you can see these in yourself. I mean, in everybody, but with schizophrenics, these things are almost fixed patterns. First of all, they're always negative. So the most common and consistent trait of schizophrenic voices is that they're consistently negative, derogatory, insulting, abusive, and destructive. And they're liars. You can't believe anything they say. You can't trust them to do anything they say they're going to do. One patient was told by his voices that if he poked his eye out, if he gouged his eye out, the voices would disappear and they wouldn't come back. So he gouged his eye out. The voices came back and said, "Well, look at what a fool you are. You listen to us. Look how stupid you are. You think we're going to, tell you the truth? No, So here he was he defaced himself for the rest of his life, and the voices are just hounding him even worse. So they're very malicious, and they may start off as a lot of times they know stuff that the patient himself doesn't know. And they use that to prove that they are some kind of god or they have some kind of special power. But if the patient buys into that, they'll slowly start turning on them. They might especially with drug addicts. I don't know how many I've had tell me in the prison that when they ran out of meth, the voices would tell them where to be and what time to be there for to get more meth, and they'd show up at that spot, and somebody would show up with the drug, over and over and over again. So they thought that was great because they were out of drugs, and here's the voices helping them get the drugs, but the drugs are killing them.
Well, that really rings true to me, because in my research, in my work, I've spoken to a lot of people who practice channeling. Channeling, it's basically mediumship and all that. Now, some of them are genuinely in contact with either dead people or with beings of light, but they're a minority. Most of them are in contact with beings who, in my opinion, masquerade as beings of light. And how do you notice it? Well, you just have to look at the life of those channelers. Most of them are divorced, separated, they're completely isolated, most of them have very serious health problems, including cancer, obesity, diabetes, whatever. And a lot of them are just in such a state that are almost drained of all their energy. And I'm sure of it now that it's those beings that masquerade as beings of light, ascended masters, dead people, to get the energy of the channeler. And I think it's really linked, or it's the same type of entity, or entities that are linked to the entities you're describing.
Yeah, I think you're right. And you brought up another good point too, is other causes that I've seen were people who were playing with Ouija boards, or there's a whole group that were infested with voices by using these spirit boxes, where they would talk to spirits through these spirit boxes, and then that voice started talking to them in their heads, and they were then considered psychotic because that voice wouldn't go away. So Ouija boards and tarot cards and some channeling. There's good channeling. There are people who channel positive spirits, but like you say, there's others who don't. Ouija boards and tarot cards and asking these spirits to come and talk to them, they have no idea what they're doing, or what they're attracting. So
Yeah, absolutely.
And another thing that I saw early on was that schizophrenics at the state hospital, they didn't want to go to church. They didn't want to go to ice cream socials held by the chaplain. They didn't want to go to Bible study. They wanted nothing to do with religion or the Bible or church or anything. And I would ask them, why are you sitting up on the ward here when the chaplains has cake and ice cream downstairs and there's a social down there? And they go, well, I don't believe in God. I don't believe in the Bible. They were anti-religious. And the ones who did try to read the Bible or go to church, the voices would get very upset with them. They'd start, there would be 3 classes of those. There would be, if the voices were weak and the person went to church, the voices would shut up when they got into the church. If the voices were moderately strong, when they got into the church, the voices would start talking and yabbing and trying to block out anything the preacher had to say. They didn't want them to hear it. And if the voices were very strong, it would make it so miserable for them that they would actually jump up and run out of the church. So why would a hallucination be anti-religious?
Yeah, and then again, it's very interesting because I've met people who are mediums, genuine mediums, in the sense that they're in contact with non-human entities, and they won't, and they're not schizophrenic or anything, but they won't even go near a church. And you can go near a church without being religious. You can visit a church. You can whatever. You can visit a church. See, especially in Europe, there's very beautiful churches, so you can just visit them. But they won't go near a church. It's very strange that I find that very strange. So you can see again that it's the same type of entities that affect some medium in a more discreet way than schizophrenics, but the theme is there.
Yeah, I think I've never had the guts to do this, but I think if a psychiatrist were to pour holy water on a schizophrenic, they would get one hell of a reaction. I'd bet money on it. So here's all these things where the voices run patterns. Another pattern they run is they get louder after sunset. So when the sun goes down, they get louder, and they are the loudest between 3 and 4 in the morning. Why would that be? They wake the patient up at 3 or 4 in the morning. They get louder when ignored. So I remember back in the state hospital when sitting there watching a psychiatrist work with one patient. He said, just ignore the voices, just ignore them. And I wondered how that worked. So I called that guy back a week later and I said, how's that working for you? He said, it doesn't work at all. Matter of fact, the voices get louder when you ignore them. You know, they won't be ignored. They demand the patient's attention. So I checked that out with a bunch of others and they all said the same thing. You can't ignore them. They won't be ignored. They won't go away. They won't get less. They get louder if you try to ignore them. And that's standard. That's a pattern. They foster self-destructive behavior. That was another thing I saw. All the schizophrenics would sabotage themselves as they got close to succeeding at anything. They would do something to mess it up. They'd cuss out the teacher in class. They wouldn't do their homework. You know, they're about to graduate. They're just about to graduate with a certificate in cosmetology or hair cutting or, you know, some trade. And then they do something to mess it up. They go off their medications. You know, and the medications were interesting because I couldn't figure out why, you know, so I started doing some experiments there. I mean, I was always experimenting and they didn't, you know, that's one of the reasons I got into trouble especially when we found a cure for schizophrenia and people and the prisoners were starting to fully recover. You know, the authorities did not like that. You know, they went nuts. I ended up in front of the medical board, the medical director, being accused of experimenting with patients, with inmates without departmental permission, which I would have never got. You know, basically all I was doing was asking them questions. So where was I going with that?
Yeah, you was saying that the voices don't want to be ignored, basically.
Yeah, they don't want to be ignored, and they foster isolation, which is the worst thing a schizophrenic can do is isolate himself, because then the voices have complete access to him and there's no interference. You know, so one thing that mothers can do, mothers of schizophrenics, is to keep their son or daughter occupied in some interesting activity, because the voices are after the attention of the victim. You know, if they can't get the attention of the victim, then they can't order them to do this self-destructive things. And what they end up doing is they're after more and more control. You know, that's what they're after. They want to control the person totally, 100%. And when they do, they just, you have a monster on your hands. Yeah.
Is that what you can deem when a person's controlled 100%? Is that what's deemed in popular language as demonic possession?
Yeah, that would be. Matter of fact, you know, at a future time, I know I've been working with a lady whose son here was a psychotic killer. He killed, I think, 4 or 5 people. And the last one, he cut his girlfriend up into little pieces, and they still haven't found her body. And you know, she's willing to talk about that and what she saw and how the voices played into that. And we can schedule her to come on at another time.
Yeah, that would be really, really interesting.
Yeah. So you know, the voices foster isolation. They want the person. They hate families. They hate husbands, they hate wives, they hate girlfriends, and they're constantly telling people negative stuff about their mothers, their fathers, their girlfriends. You know, don't trust them. They're trying to screw you. They're talking behind your back. They don't really care about you. You know, all that kind of stuff.
Well, that's again, it ties in. There's a researcher who I interviewed, Eve Logan, and she's specialized in the way non-human entities affect relationships, whether they're love relationships, friendship relationships, work relationships. And she found out that those entities often target happy couples and cause separation. And we're not talking about schizophrenia, we're talking about everyday people.
Yes, that's exactly right. you know, and you can actually see that, you know, when you work with these people. Okay, so you know, one of the things I think this is where I was going with that other thing is one of the things I couldn't figure out. One of the things I couldn't figure out was why they would go off their meds. You know, now it stands to reason that the side effects are awful, but when you look at the psychotic state that they would go into, you know, if they were off their meds, it was much worse. You know, so
Yes, the
here I'm
worst.
like going, almost all of them would go off their meds. And it was almost like they were voluntarily choosing to go psychotic again. And that was the result. You go off your meds, you go psychotic. And virtually every single one of them would say the psychotic state was much worse than the side effects of these meds. You know, at least they were somewhat calmed down. They could sleep with the meds. The voices were less, they weren't as strong. Okay, so the meds did do that. They cured absolutely nothing, but they weakened the voices where these people, some of them could actually begin to function again. So here they are somewhat functional, and then all of a sudden they decide to go off their meds. And I would ask them, you know, well, what's worse, the meds or being psychotic? And they would all say being psychotic was much worse. That brings up another thought, is what the voices would tell these patients was they'd point to the awful side effects of these antipsychotic meds, and they would tell the patient that you're being poisoned by the psychiatrist, and these are the effects of you being poisoned. And in effect, they were being poisoned by the psychiatrist. These meds are toxic. They do cause permanent damage to the brain if they're used long enough. And that's what would bring about the attacks on the psychiatrist. So when I first went to the state hospital, I would see that the psychiatrists were being beat up by schizophrenics at a rate that was much higher than, you know, assaults on any of the other staff, psych nurses, counselors, psychologists, dentists, all the rest. It was the psychiatrists who were being assaulted by these patients at a much higher rate than anybody else. And I'm wondering, well, why is that happening? Because the psychiatrists in the institutions, in the state institutions, would only spend 15 to 20 minutes a month with these people. And I'm like, what are they doing to piss these guys off so bad that they're getting beat up in 15 or 20 minutes once a month that they spend with these guys, where the assault rate on attendants that are with them 24 hours a day is roughly equivalent to the assault rate on psychiatrists. You know, why is that? And it turns out that it's because the voices don't want the patient to take those meds, because the meds weaken the voices. Even though they don't get rid of them, they weaken them and they calm the patient down. You know, they're major tranquilizers. And the voices need to keep the patient upset. They need to keep them angry, anxious, fearful, shameful, you know, in some negative state, in order to generate that negative emotional energy that they feed off of. And when the patient is gorked out and tranquilized, they can't do that. It's harder for them to do that. So they don't want them taking those medications, and they'll tell them they're poisoned, you're being poisoned, and the patient can look for himself and see that they are being poisoned. Yeah. But at least they can somewhat function. So when I started checking into that and asking patients like, well, why are you going off the meds? They would all say because of the side effects. So what I would do is I drew up two conditions. I would ask them when they went off their meds and they went back on and they recovered and they were sane again. I would give them a blank piece of paper and say, write down all the reasons, all the side effects that you had from your medications, because they don't all experience the same side effects. So they'd write down, 5 or 6 side effects, and then I'd give them a checklist of all the psychotic symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia taken out of the DSM, and say, well, put a check mark next to each one of these awful experiences you've had when you weren't on the meds. And bam, that bam, 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 all these horrible experiences, monsters coming out of the wall, blood coming out of the wall, voices telling them to kill themselves, people talking behind their backs, voices appearing out of nowhere, all these horrible things. And I said, put a check mark next to each one of these you've experienced. And then when they were done, I'd hand them both back to them. I said, which one is worst? And every single one of them would say the symptoms of psychosis were much worse. They much worse. And then I'd ask them, well, then why do you go off your meds? And every single one of them would say, I don't know. I don't know. And I'm like, if they don't know, who does? And that went on for like 3 years. Asking, I felt like a crazy guy myself, asking the same question over and over and over again and getting the same response to this situation that didn't make any sense. Why are they choosing the worst of those two choices, the much worse, consistently choosing it? And virtually all of them at some point go off their meds, and they'll go off their meds over and over and over and over again.
Yeah, it's really something terrible. The voices are really trying to destroy them in every aspect, and they, like with the medicines, the small positive side of them is that they tranquilize the patient. But what the entities do is they exacerbate the negative side of the medicines. They exacerbate everything that's negative. They blow the negative up and destroy the positive.
Yeah, you're right on with that. I mean, that's right on the head. That's right. That's exactly what they do. If a bad situation comes up for a schizophrenic, they'll take that and they'll magnify it. They'll pour gasoline on the fire and make it as bad as they possibly can. And one of the opposite things you can do is when something good happens to you is accentuate that. They don't like that. They want your mind to be totally in the negative. They don't care about you. They want that negative emotional energy to be generated. That's what they feed off of. So they foster isolation. They hate parents. They hate marriages. They hate babies. They hate girlfriends. They hate families. They want the person totally isolated, apart from everybody who could possibly help them.
Yeah, that's true, and that's even true in your everyday life. I mean, if you've got a tendency to be anxious or something, nothing to do with schizophrenia. I'm talking about people that function, that have an ordinary family life, that have good jobs, that are happy in their everyday life, but they've got a tendency to anxiety. And I think it's happened to most of us, that they'll exacerbate a fear that's not grounded in reality and just take away everything that's good. You'll just think about a fear that's not grounded in reality. And I've noticed that it happens to a lot of people. It's very subtle how they work, and at different degrees, the extreme degrees of schizophrenic, but people that are ordinary people, again, they'll be affected too. I mean, even when you do something, and that happens often. For example, you're going to a wonderful holiday in the Bahamas, and you've got a slight fear about planes. That's just an example. You'll be thinking all the time about the plane journey going there, the plane journey back, and you won't even think about the holidays. And I've noticed that with a lot of people, and that's everyday examples.
Yeah, and to them, it doesn't matter how they generate that negative emotional energy. And one of the most prevalent ways they do that is by telling lies to their victims, and trying to get their victims to believe their lies. So I noticed that when I was working with them at the state hospital, that the voices would tell them constant stream of lies that would upset them. you know. And one of the things I'd point up is, you know, do you trust these things? And they go, no, I don't trust them. You know, but yet they would listen to them. It's almost like they couldn't blot them out of their minds. The voices could go in there and they could pull up every negative memory that they've ever had and bring it to their attention and say, look at this, look what a rotten person you are. You did this, you did that, you said this, you said that, you know, they're constant liars, you know, and it doesn't matter to them what they tell you as long as they can generate that negative emotional energy. So, you know, when I met Sherry, she came up with something called the That's a Lie program, which again says every negative thought about yourself or anybody else is a lie. So it's the same thing with what the voices tell these patients, that virtually everything they tell these patients, schizophrenics, is a lie. So Sherry came up with the That's a Lie program, okay? And you can find that on our website at jerrymarzinsky.com and go to the articles section. And Sherry's got a 2-page paper there about the That's a Lie program. So those of you who are schizophrenic or parents who are dealing with schizophrenic children, get that program and put it to use. It will short circuit the voices and make them less potent by a long shot. It's one of the single most powerful programs that we have. Because if they can't convince you that they're telling the truth, then they can't grab onto that. You know, and I think we talk about that in our book also.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to talk about, because in your book, in the last chapter, you offer really easy solutions against those voices. And how if you're a schizophrenic, or even for people who are tormented by those intrusive thoughts, and that's 99% of the population, I'd say, how can you how can you, I wouldn't say treat, but how can you get those entities away from you? That's really important. That's crucial. What are your methods for really getting rid of those entities?
Yeah, so what psychiatry and psychology should be looking at is how to get rid of these entities instead of how to drug the brain.
Because
You know,
because I spoke with an exorcist priest, and basically very interesting man. We had a long discussion and everything, and he was talking about entities, his exorcisms he did and all that. And then I asked him, how does an exorcism take place? And he says basically you sometimes have to fight with the demon. So I was thinking that creates, and he was a very intelligent man, very knowledgeable, but I was saying when you fight with the demon, that creates negative energy and it feeds the demon back. And Paul and Benino, who are father and son team, who've written about those parasitic entities, when I spoke to them, they said exactly what I thought when I met that priest, that when a person gets an exorcism, and they're often very complicated to do, sometimes very expensive, because there's all a big business around that also, which is quite sick in my opinion. But anyway, they were saying that in most of the cases, the exorcism succeeded to start with, and then the entities come back with a vengeance. And that's because
yes.
There's a lot of violence in the exorcism. And what I like with your methods is that they're very simple.
Well, the other thing is you're not teaching the patient how to get rid of the voices themselves. You know, you're depending on the preacher to do that. Now, they can do that. I've seen it done. I've done it. But the thing is, if you don't teach the patient how to get rid of the voices themselves, then they're you know, it's a temporary thing. It's like, you know, they have to change the channel. They have to change their frequency, and they have to do that by moving in a positive spiritual direction. Now, that's something that psychiatry and psychology aren't going to touch. You know, they they have no concept that the human being is a spiritual entity, in a human body, especially psychiatry. Their whole identity depends on them being able to drug the brain and to get people to believe that they have broken brains and there's something wrong with them. But if you look at it, all these mental illnesses have to do with thought, your thought processes. If you're obsessive compulsive, those are obsessive compulsive thoughts. They're not your thoughts. They don't belong to you. You're the one who's watching them. You're the one who's listening to them. You are not the thoughts. So that's the first thing people need to wake up to, is that they are not their thoughts, and their thoughts may or may not belong to who they are. Swedenborg says none of your thoughts are your own. They come from another dimension, and they are energetic entities. And nobody's ever seen a thought. Nobody's ever poked a thought. They belong to another universe, and they're very difficult to study because there is no physical form to them. They're energetic entities. And I've seen the same thing with exorcisms. They drive away these things for a while, and then they come back with a vengeance, just like you said. It doesn't solve the problem. And it doesn't solve the problem because the person isn't changing their frequency. They need to get on a positive spiritual path and stay there. They're already at the end of the road in the negative side, and it's a dualistic universe. There's good, there's bad, there's black, there's white, there's hot, there's cold. So they're at the negative end of things. And, they must realize that there's a positive entities also. But those positive entities, they don't step in unless the person's right on the verge of death most of the time. And they don't talk in words, they talk in feelings and intuition. And they can't help the patient unless he asks for that help. They're not allowed to interfere with the person's life against the person's will. That's not so with the negative entities. They can barge in there and do whatever they want whenever they want. Nothing to stop them. So, the exorcism doesn't work. They have to realize that they are not their thoughts, and that there's a difference between their thoughts and who they are.
And at one time in your book, towards the end, you give a program, if you like, in a few bullet points, and I find that program really interesting because it's easy. It's really easy to do. Can you tell us more about it? Because I think it's the most important and interesting part of your book. It's really something that's very helpful in my opinion. So can you tell us about it?
Which
it's
which one?
It's in fact it's Sherry's program.
Yeah, That's a Lie program.
Yeah, can you give us a few details basically about it? I know it's on Sherry's website, but so the listeners can understand what they'll be what they'll be seeing and all that.
Well, bottom line, it's very simple. Is that any negative thought about yourself or anybody else comes from these dark entities, and they're not true. So the way that these entities grasp on is they get you to believe what they're saying. And they're telling you negative things about yourself, everybody else around you. So if you know they're liars, and most of what they say is lies, then they can't hook on to you. It's like trying to grab a greased pig. You can't clutch onto it because you got no traction. So here they come and they say, you're stupid, you're ugly, everybody's talking behind your back, and you say, that's a lie. It's like, get out of my face. That's a lie. If it's a lie, then you don't pay attention to it. What they're after is your attention. They're like fishermen grasping, they bait the hook. They can go in your mind and they can pull up every negative thing you ever did. And they cast the hook and they go, well, let me see if you bite on that one. And they throw this thought in your face and see if you react. If you react to it, they got you. Now they're generating negative emotional energy and they're feeding off it. So it's like what Carlos Castaneda says is they give you their mind. So what you have is two minds in there, the patient's mind and the mind of this entity that has invaded your thought processes. And they hit us all. It's not just, it's schizophrenics where it's most predominant, but they hit us all.
And at one time you say something very important, to listen to pleasant music, instrumental only. Now, it's very interesting because I enjoy quiet music. But I always listen to music with a voice, with a song, and instrumental music. Why instrumental music, and why not music with voices?
Well, one of the things that they feed off of is any kind of negative energy. So that's one of the things that mothers and people who have schizophrenics living with them is keep them away from everything negative. War movies, sad love stories, bad news, war, murder mysteries, all that kind of stuff. That just feeds these negative entities. So what happens with a lot of songs is you have, oh, my boyfriend left me and I'm going to die and I just can't stand in life anymore and I can't live without him. And, or that rap music is like, yeah, kill the police, and they'll take that and they'll use it to generate negative emotional energy. So they can't take music that doesn't have any words. They're not going to like it. They don't like the 369 frequency either. So, if you go to YouTube and you get that frequency and play it, they hate that. They hate the 23rd Psalm.
Yeah.
A number of patients have told me that repeating the 23rd Psalm is like throwing worms on a hot frying pan. They can't stand it. It's like punching them in the face. So why would a hallucination react to the 23rd Psalm? See, so all this bull crap that psychiatry is putting over on the population, if they would study these voices, they would see that there's a number of patterns that they run over and over again. Gaslighting is another one. I remember one patient where they convinced him that he had murdered somebody, and he didn't know whether he had or not. He wasn't sure. And he was going to kind of thinking, well, maybe I should go to the police department and tell them I murdered somebody. And then he goes, well, what if I didn't murder somebody? Then they're going to lock me up for being crazy. And on the other hand, he goes, well, what if I did murder somebody and the cops are looking for me? So they had him trapped in this catch-22 situation. No matter what he did, he was generating negative emotional energy for them. That's what they're after. They could care less for us. They hate us as humans. What they want is just that negative emotional energy, and they have to turn it negative before they can take it. So they're constantly after more and more control. They also manipulate perception. They will get the victim to interpret any neutral statement as negative.
And can they induce visual hallucinations?
Yeah, they can. Yeah, they can. The other thing, they have complete access to the schizophrenic's memory, which I talked to before. So I remember a couple of incidents. This came up twice, and one of the most devastating things I've ever seen was that this two cases where this came up were an abused woman, but badly abused by either a boyfriend or an uncle or somebody like that, had died, and they were at the funeral, and they were glad that this guy had finally died. So, the abuse is over. And all of a sudden, here's this voice comes into their head, going, oh, no, I'm not dead. I'm still haunting you. You remember when you did this or we did that? And that was information that only the victim knew. Nobody else knew that except this voice in their head. And here's the body of the guy that the voice is telling them is now plaguing them from beyond the grave. And it wasn't the spirit of the dead person. It was a voice that moved in and goes, oh, here's a prime victim. I could take advantage of this. They also demand that the victim not tell anybody about the voices, because then they'll go, oh, you tell anybody about us, then they'll know you're crazy, and you'll get locked up. So one of the point of advice I'd have is for moms and fathers to listen to what their daughters or sons have to say about the voices. The voices don't like to be exposed. You know, they want everything kept in secret. It's like a child molester. You know, they don't want anybody being told about what they're doing. You know.
And also, you say at one point in your in Sherry Swiney says in her protocol to do 1 or 2 good things for yourself each day. What do you imply by that exactly? And
well, the voices don't want you doing anything good for yourself. You know, they don't want you to be happy. They will steer the person completely away from anything that makes them feel good, or anything that generates joy or gratitude or appreciation or any kind of positive emotional state. They will try to drive them away from that. You know? Again, they can only siphon negative emotional energy. So when you're just walking around, all of a sudden the negative thought comes into your head. It's them putting it there. You know, it's them feeding that for the negative emotion that they can get out of it. Even one negative thought generates negative emotional energy. And if they can keep that stream going, you know, it gets stronger and stronger until the patient can't break out of it. You know? They short circuit reason. They tell the patient to do stuff that's just totally unreasonable, you know, that they know that's going to get them in trouble. You know.
So, well, really, thank you for this interview. It's been really, really interesting, and it's been really your book's really been an eye-opener for me, because it's actually confirmed quite a few things, quite a bit of information I received through studying the alien abduction phenomenon, and also through studying world events and the ritual aspect of world events. So it's really confirmed all that indirectly, and it's really made me realize how important those voices were in our everyday life, how they affected us in our everyday life. And also, what I really enjoy is that you offer simple solutions, nothing complicated, no big protocols, no big seminars, just simple solutions. So where can people get your book, and how can they get through to you? How can they contact you?
Well, they can contact me through the contact section of our website at jerrymarzinsky.com. They can get Sherry's program from the articles section, and there's a contact section there for. I'm still running a small clinical practice, working with people who are really motivated. I only take one person a day at the most, and if they're motivated, I'll work with them. So yeah, the book can be purchased from our website too, at jerrymarzinsky.com, and spelled MARZINSKY.
Well, thank you very much, Jerry, and it would be really great to have you on again, and this time we could talk about your research and how it applies to current events, because it's all linked anyway. So it would be really a pleasure to have you on again in a few weeks' time to talk about how it applies to current events and the world situation.
Well, that's exactly what's going on right now. These governments are full of these demons, and you can see what they're doing. If you look down all of these patterns, you'll see that the government is doing the same thing to us that the voices do to schizophrenics. It's the same pattern. Isolate, you know, negative thoughts, spreading fear, spreading condemnation, breaking people up, making them miserable, I mean, every single one of these patterns that affect schizophrenics also apply to world governments at the present time. You know, so they're eaten up by these things, and people need to realize that these are demonic entities that are driving these people, and they're the ones that are making us miserable. But I can do you one better. I know a couple of schizophrenics that I've worked with that would be willing to come on and talk to you about what it's like and what the voices are like and what they experienced.
Well, that would be really interesting, because that's really interesting to hear it from the people who've experienced those voices. That's would be really, really interesting.
Well, we can arrange that down the road.
That would really be a pleasure. So thank you very much, Jerry, and looking forward to speaking to you again.
Okay, well, thanks for having me on.
Goodbye then, and speak to you soon.
Okay.
Thank you very much.